Good evening and welcome to Journey Home Canada. That's right, tonight is the first of our episodes that we want to feature Canadian converts and reverts to the Catholic Church. This will carry on the tradition that we started last year of featuring on the third Monday of each month a international convert. And those of your regular viewers of the Journey Home program have watched the tapes that we did of our trip to England, and we hope in the future to do more of those overseas trips. But what we wanted to do in terms of following up after the British converts is now feature Canadian guests. And tonight, Julie Waters is our first guest. Actually, you may have noticed on the website that Father Nikolai was scheduled for tonight, and it turns out that he had other scheduling conflicts. So we've got him scheduled for another night, but Julie was able to jump in and be our first Canadian on the Journey Home Canadian segment, so I'm glad you've joined us tonight. I want to right off the bat tell you the phone number because your questions are an important part of our program. So if you have a question for Julie, give us a call at 1-800-221-9460, or if you're outside North America, give us a call at 205-271-2980, or you can send us an email at journeyhome@EWTN.com. Julie, welcome to the Journey Home.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's good to have you here, even though you say you're part of Canada, you're not quite ready or able to get the Journey Home program, is that right?
Not yet, through regulation complications where it's not available north of the border yet.
Okay, by satellite.
By
right?
satellite.
I know that some places in Canada can get it by cable, but
yes.
So let's just keep praying for those doors to open up. But you said your family will get to see the program on tape after you get home.
They will.
That's good. Well, it's good to have you on the Journey Home, and thank you for being our first Canadian guest. We've had Canadian guests before, but this is the first official one as a part of our regular segment that we'd like to do. But as I told you earlier, we usually begin the program with inviting a guest to talk about your spiritual background. So why don't you let the audience get a glimpse of where you came from spiritually before you became a Catholic?
Okay. Well, I was baptized and raised in an Anglican family, the Anglican Church of Canada, which is the same as your Episcopalian here in the States. It was a long tradition in my mother's family. They came from England and they'd been Anglican for centuries and centuries. And my father's family, they had switched from the Quaker faith about 1900. So there were staunch Anglicans on both sides of the family, and we were proud wherever we lived to go to church and to sing the beautiful songs in the Anglican church and do the beautiful liturgy. And I grew up thinking that's what I was. In my early childhood, that's what I was, and I was quite content and thought this is the way it was going to be.
In fact, you mentioned, well, first of all, you mentioned that your family has some very strong American roots, right? Was it your mother's side that was...
My father's side.
Was on the, 1637?
1637 came to Boston, yes. Yeah.
And in case those of you that don't catch the significance of that date, Boston wasn't founded until 1620. So that's within 17 years of the founding of Boston. So that's really a long-standing tradition here in the States. And then when did your family
They gradually
emigrate?
Drifted north through the 1700s and crossed the not yet existing border at around 1800 and established a mill and a store in what was then the eastern townships of Upper Canada at that time.
Yeah, Upper Canada.
Upper Canada, yeah.
Which is really more of a western part of Canada, right? I mean, isn't that
well, central.
That's right, that's right. But Upper was considered looking from Quebec, right, in that direction. That's right. Now, in your Anglican upbringing, did you go through what is often called kind of the conveyor belt of the church? I mean, just through the system, baptized, catechized, confirmed, and the usual kind of shoots through the educational system Did it
Yes.
catch?
It did a little. It did a little. As I said, I loved the music. That's where my prayer was growing up, was in the beautiful music. I
I
remember.
hear that a lot from Anglicans.
Yeah, I remember learning the Magnificat in chant when I was 11, and I still know it by heart. It was very beautiful. And the Te Deum. So there were some things there that really stayed with me in giving adoration to God. But when I went for my confirmation, there was a general confession, which terrified me. I'd had no examination or tradition or learning of examination before. I was really lost in that. So examination was something that left me really, really uncomfortable. And then that was it. There was no follow-up after. And I thought, well, this opened up something, but I don't know what.
Yeah. This idea kind of like it was a rite of passage. You've arrived after confirmation, and sadly, your experience is so similar to so many others. I mean, Catholics, as well as my Lutheran upbringing, is very similar. I know other mainline Protestant churches that have this system in place, a long-standing kind of tradition of catechetics, and we kind of assume once we put our children in one end of this chute, they're going to come out the others, and we give a stamp on them at confirmation, and there they are, they've arrived. But would you say that in your own experience, you had that whole experience, you got the stamp of confirmation, but did it bring you to a heart-converted relationship with Christ at that point? Or?
Not completely at that point. I mean, I loved Christ at that point. I did realize that my job in life as a Christian was to find him and follow him and stick with him. I did learn that much. But how to proceed, where to get help, and basically what to do as a teenager growing up, I couldn't see the guidance there where I was.
And how those teachings that you had connected with the moral choices as a teenager, as a young adult. Often that was left for the teenager, young adult to kind of figure out for themselves. And if they didn't have a lot of data, of course, it didn't leave a lot of instruction for that. Now, was your Anglican faith a part of your marriage? Was it an important part of your marriage?
No, it was kind of lapsed and forgotten and neglected by the time I got married, because I'd seen that it wasn't giving me the strength that I was looking for, and that there were some things that I hadn't yet discovered.
Yeah, all right. Well, what was it that began your search towards the Catholic Church? Because first of all, was the Catholic Church at all a dot on the horizon when you were growing up? Had you ever thought about the Catholic Church? Or?
I had a friend who lived on the street, who was part of a mixture of one Catholic parent and one Anglican parent. And the family life seemed to be very happy there. It was a large and generous family. Everyone seemed to get along, to get on each other's nerves sometimes, but it was a kind of family life and spiritual family life that intrigued me.
So what was it that started getting your interest in the Catholic Church then?
Well, as a young adult, I sang at a wedding, and I was newly married, and I started to think, well, there's more to this. There's Jesus, who's wonderful. I'm going to follow Jesus, but in order to do so, to be holy, which is what we do in imitating Christ as much as we can, we imitate what we love. What am I going to do? Where am I going to learn about that? This idea of holiness intrigued me, and I didn't know how to learn about it. I didn't know where to go, so I wrote a letter to an Anglican priest who was a friend of mine that I'd sung at a wedding, and he'd been the officiator there. And I wrote to him and explained my dilemma. And he wrote me back with a delightful long list of saints to read about.
Saints to read about.
Saints to read about.
Anglican saints to read about?
All kinds of saints. mostly Catholic saints.
Yeah. That's interesting that he would, did it surprise you that his immediate direction was to point you to the lives of these saints? I mean, were you expecting a a more didactic presentation of holiness? He pointed to the lives of
He
people.
totally surprised me.
Yeah.
I thought, because he was a very good speaker, I thought that he would write out one of his lectures for me.
Okay.
And because he was a well-known speaker in Montreal. But he instead gave me recommendations of biographies of how people had strived to live holiness. And I became interested in finding out what went into holiness and the virtues, what powers that people discover through faith in order to grow closer to Christ and follow Christ better.
I'm curious of who were some of the first saints then you started reading about that impressed you in that
Well,
list.
St. Augustine, I guess the people, and St. Thomas More.
Yeah.
The people who appealed to me, I think, were those who I found something in common with. People who were not in the Catholic Church, but who were looking for something, who had a struggle from where they were, and didn't really know where they were going, but knew that they'd passed beyond what they'd learned in their childhood and what their previous faith knowledge was.
Well, it definitely would be Augustine, I mean, in his own journeys. And in a sense, holiness was a long time coming for Augustine. He struggled with that in his own journey. And so you were impressed by these saints. Was it then, so you read the lives of the saints, was it making a significant distinction to you that some of them were Anglicans or non-Catholics and some of them were these Catholic saints? I mean, were you drawn at first to then go toward the Catholic Church because of those saints, or did not make a difference at first? Oh, okay.
It made a difference because the overwhelming majority, when you look back at the history of holy people that have been, that we've written stories about, you see that overwhelming amount of them were practicing the Catholic faith. And yes, there were some in England, and I was also interested in those, but I can't remember offhand the name of the one in East Anglia that I was interested in knowing about because of the history of my mother's family. But there weren't that many.
Clitheroe, was it? Margaret Clitheroe?
Margaret Clitheroe, that rings a bell. That rings a bell.
She was one of the martyrs, the English martyrs, yeah.
So, but it was Thomas More of the English saints. It was Thomas More who really.
Why was that? I know you're involved with financial management, right? I mean, that's your occupation, and he was a professional. Is it a loyal legal advisor? Was that part of what drew you to Thomas More?
No, it was much more his family life. How he took a great interest in everyone who was part of his household, and he had great friendship with the people there in his family. He took great care with young people when they were courting each other. He had very good judgment and discernment of who was matching well with who, and he took a lot of loving care of these people who lived in his household. And of course, he died for his faith.
Yeah, what'd you think about that? Because here you were an Anglican, and his decision was cross current to what was happening.
Well, I think that he was up against someone who had started out very close and devoted to the faith, but who became unstable and lost his reason. And St. Thomas More continued to love him and had to, according to his conscience and his freedom as a person, live that freedom to die for his faith, no matter what was offered to him.
Thomas More is such a fascinating character because it wasn't just that he was standing boldly on his conscience against a tyrant. It wasn't just those issues. He was standing against a very personal friend. And that was equally difficult for him, even though it doesn't always come out in a man for all seasons. But that was part of that real struggle, was that it was a friend that he was having to turn away from. And they had been defenders of the faith together.
Yes, they had.
So that makes it a unique part of that issue So on the one hand, being a model of this family man and all of his friendships, that was acting out Christ in those relationships, but then recognizing when those friendships were a burden or a standing in a way of what was true. He had to take a stand in what was true.
Mm-hmm.
Was your husband interested in this journey? Or was your husband in all?
He was a very quiet, gentle bystander. He gave me Newman's Apologia because I was moaning and groaning in our first years of marriage. I was saying, I'm not happy where I am and don't know where I'm going. And he went back to the church after a period of about 15 years where he was away from the church. So when he went back completely with great faith.
To the Catholic Church.
To the Catholic Church. And this made a big impression upon me. But he said, Julie, you are completely free. You do not have to follow me. This is personal. This is up to you. But I was at that time I was already involved in my quest for holiness. And so he thought that was pretty good. But he said he was very gentle. He sort of take your time. And in fact, I kept a lot of my questions and doubts and concerns very private. And occasionally he would give me things to read. He would give me books that he liked, Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, and I always shared his interest in Catholic literature.
I was going to say, he was really sharing Catholic culture with you in a wider sense, yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's very smart. But you did mention the Apologia Pro Vita Sua of Newman's own description of his journey. Did that have a big impact then on your
That had a very big impact. Because one of my concerns was loyalty to my family and the tradition of the past in my family. And I didn't want to cause suffering to those in my family for something I had tested them and I knew that they would not yet understand. So he helped me to move beyond that, to see things in a different way.
So you've read Newman, you've read all these biographies of saints, you're being drawn to the church, your husband has returned to the church. Was it an automatic for you, or was there some kicking and screaming? What were some other hurdles you had to get over to make that final entrance into the church?
Well, I had a lot of friends. I had a lot of support. Some friends, when I was living in Vancouver, got me a job managing a Catholic choir. And I said, I don't know anything about the Catholic liturgy, although with the Anglican liturgy being similar, I knew quite a bit. But they said, we'll guide you. We'll show you. You just have to be open to learn. So they were a tremendous support to me. But I went for instruction, and then I said, no, can't do this. This doesn't feel right yet. And I explained to my mother-in-law, who was also a convert. She said, don't worry, Julie. You'll be miserable for a while, and then just keep praying for the gift of faith. And that's what the priest told me as well. And I told him, I would love to do this, but something in me says I'm not ready. And he says, you're just not praying enough for the gift of faith. So it's to really, really be demanding with God. And so I had to wait longer.
Okay. Your children had something to do with the final journey, didn't they? Your child was...
Well, I realized that I could not teach my children what I did not have. And therefore I had a responsibility to know really well what I did have and to move along in my life.
So when did you come into the church then?
I came into the church almost 20 years ago.
Is that right? Okay.
It's during a blizzard.
In Canada?
Yes, in Canada.
Not the one where all the ice was on everything, and that was only a couple years ago.
No, not that one, no. And my husband was in Reston, Virginia on a business trip, and I didn't tell him anything about it. And he came home and he said, when I went with my sister and a couple of good friends, and I'd been to see a priest a couple of weeks before, and I said, I'm ready. I'm thirsting for the sacraments. I can take this step beyond thinking I need to know more. I don't know enough. God is not going to deceive me in stepping into the Catholic Church. And so I took that step while my husband was away on business. So he came home and he said, hi, what's new? I said, well, actually, dear, sit down. And I told him that I joined the church, and he was floored.
Pleased?
Pleased, very pleased. It was something he'd been hoping for a while, but we hadn't mentioned it because he wanted to leave me completely free, and I wanted to be completely free.
Your journey towards the church began with this seeking on the issue of holiness, and I know, talk about what's that's led you into now. I mean, 20 years you've been a Catholic, but it's a part of your apostolate now, of your work as a layperson, right? The issues of virtues. Talk about that, if you would.
Okay. I teach virtues as a volunteer with groups of families, groups of parents, on establishing the virtues in their family life so they can build their supernatural life upon them. Because we know that supernatural life is built upon natural life, and so it has to be a good, solid natural life, and it's more fun that way too. So I teach courses to parents, and we start off with the virtues which go with younger children, and we work our way up through the stages of development.
Is there any materials you use that you recommend to folk if they're interested in learning more about the virtues?
Well, there's David Isaac's book of virtues from the University of Navarre, which is quite good. And there's Jim Stenson's books, Upbringing, which is a wonderful book for discussion. It's questions and answers, discussions. And then another book he has on building spiritual life called Lifelines. Those are wonderful. Parents love those, no matter what the age of their children. They enjoy reading those.
You were describing to me earlier about in your teaching of virtues, you build on the natural virtues first, right? And then you develop to the spiritual virtues. And it was reminding me of when John the Cross and others talk about the different journeys of the spiritual life, and that those first journeys, you're taking care of the external, the sensual part of your life. You're getting that cleaned up, and I mean, that's the natural virtues. You're working on that, and once you can get through that, then you can progress to the next stages, which is the inner and the more deeper spiritual. Would that be in line with what you're teaching?
Quite a bit in line, quite a bit in line. You start off with order and obedience, especially with very small children who don't have the understanding but still need to learn to do good things before they understand that they're good. So we start off with that. And then order, because that establishes also the priorities for the spiritual life too. Because if you see order as being good for man and man's relationship with God, it's you don't have to break anything to reestablish it later. And then generosity, growing beyond yourself and sharing with your family. All those proceed quite nicely, and they create a wonderful family atmosphere too.
All right. Building on the natural virtues that really come are in everyone's heart there as a result of natural law, and they're all there, then building on that. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure I mentioned it to the audience, but you're from Montreal, right?
Montreal, that's right.
Area, good. And in case anyone's up in Montreal and is interested in what you've just said, they might get in touch with you about these issues. And we're going to take a break. Back just a moment with some of your questions for Julie about your journey and maybe about the issues of holiness and virtues. So again, that phone number is 1-800-221-9460. Outside the United States, you can give us a call at 205-271-2980. We'll be back in just a moment. Hello, welcome back to tonight's episode of The Journey Home. As I mentioned earlier, it's our first of our Canadian segments, and Julie Waters is with us tonight. And thank you, Julie, for sharing us your journey earlier, and I'm sure we'll have more questions that might dig a little deeper in some areas of your journey. But we do have a couple callers and some email that are waiting for us. Why don't we take our first caller tonight? It's Bianca from Massachusetts. Hello, Bianca. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi, Marcus. Thank you for taking my phone call. I've been watching your programs, and thanks for the program, by the way. I am a Catholic. I was born and raised as a Catholic. But the last 3 years, I have been attending an Anglican church. And the reason why I have been attending the church is because of the music and the harmonies. Not that I really agree with the theology, because I don't. I'm against homosexuals. I do not, and especially in my church, they're very liberal. And I have a much more traditional views of my religion.
Yeah, but you're drawn to the music. And Bianca, that's a common statement, especially for Anglicans that have come into the church. How do you feel about that transition from that Anglican hymnology?
Well, the Anglican music is beautiful, and the tradition of making excellence in the musical prayer that you give to God I'm sure it is pleasing to God. But the sacraments, if you're looking for the fullness of the sacraments, they're not there. So there's beauty, and there's a lot of very good things in the worship in the Anglican Church. But the fullness of the sacraments, the fullness of the faith is not there. And maybe that's why you find something very good, but there's also the recognition that it's not the same.
It's not the fullness.
It's not the fullness.
I'm going to give an example, and I don't want any Anglican viewers to get real mad at me, because this is an extreme example. But it's Christmas time, and you can imagine how you feel if you get a present that's beautifully wrapped with gorgeous paper and beautiful bows, and then you open it up, and what's inside doesn't match what's on the outside. All right, and so that's kind of the way we feel about it. It's the tradition I came from was a different kind of music. It was more of an evangelical Presbyterian, and I loved that. And I've always been happy with the music I've sung in our local parish. Mm-hmm. But I'm not out for the wrappings. I want the fullness of the faith. And so, we're working to have to work on the music in our local parishes. That's part of our, that's part of what I think is the reason that the Lord's bringing some Anglicans into the church.
That could be it. That could be it.
Because it is wonderful when you hear that wonderful harmonies that are sung in those in the really strong Anglican hymns. There's a pride there in them, in a good sense.
Yes, there is.
That wonderful traditional music.
And St. Augustine said that he who sings prays twice over.
That's right.
So it's good, but gifts, as you mentioned, are there to be unwrapped, to see where the essence is beneath, what's latent there.
And I might make a challenge to Anglican viewers that why has the leadership, at least here in America, moved so far in a direction that's got to be different than where a lot of the Anglicans are spiritually and morally, and the decisions they've made, turning away from the scriptural understanding of human sexuality. You wonder if there's a danger of getting so caught up in the wrappings that you lose track of really what's at the core of the faith. That's what's most important. And we love the great music and the other aspects of ritual, but if what's missing at the core, then it's a very hollow shell. And my biggest request is that we keep in prayer the Anglicans, particularly Episcopalians in this country, that are really going through a rough time, trying to struggle out what to do with the decision that's been made. That looks like if it doesn't split, it will cause great confusion amongst so many very faithful Anglicans and Episcopalians. Let's take this email. In some ways along the same lines. This comes from a fan in Connecticut, from Millie. And she writes, love your show. Thank you, Millie. Not sure if I have more of a comment or a question tonight. I left the Anglican communion and came home 10 years ago. Welcome home. But I sorely miss our traditions of evening vespers and the beautiful Christmas traditions we had practiced before. Not that I would change anything for the world, but I do miss it. Is that okay? The same thing. You miss some of those, the traditions of the evening vespers? I'm not sure exactly what she meant because I didn't practice those as a Presbyterian, but.
Well, the evening vespers were something my grandmother went to. They were gone from the parish where I grew up by the time I was growing up. But my grandmother went and received a lot of peace and consolation from them. So yes, there are beautiful traditions there, and I don't think there's any harm in remembering them and enjoying them. Good music is good music, but to think that they reflect something more about the faith than they actually do is to perhaps be, spiritually dishonest.
It's interesting. I know that when I was a Presbyterian, during the last years when I was a pastor, that there were a lot of liturgical books being introduced from the headquarters. The General Assembly were introducing a more formal liturgical experience to many of us Presbyterians. A lot of us didn't want to go there, but they were being introduced very formal liturgical books. And now that I think about it, I wonder if it's because some were trying to capture this feeling that is sometimes experienced in this more formal Anglican austere tradition. We were hoping to capture some of that feeling. And again, it's a bit of the wrappings. But there's something else I'd like to say, is that Vatican II says in a document, Ecumenism, makes the statement that whatever the Holy Spirit has engraced in the hearts of our separated brethren is for our spiritual renewal. So we can learn from the beauties of that, because we do have what's called the daily office. We have morning and evening prayer, which is exactly the same thing, a little bit different wording. And so we can make our gathering at our local parish of evening prayer is evening vespers. We can work on it. We can work on the music. We can enjoy it. We can work hard at it. We can take it seriously. And the church has called the laity to gather for evening prayer. And it's there for us. But we just have to develop that tradition. And maybe some Anglicans that have come into the church can help us capture that.
Yes, there's a good possibility.
Let's take our next caller, Rick from Michigan. Hello, what's your call for us tonight?
Hi, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Catholic experience in Canada. Do Canadian Catholics and Christians in general struggle with the issues of separation of church and state like we do in the United States? And in particular, is there public reading of the Bible or prayer allowed in the public schools in Canada?
Thanks, Rick, for your question.
Well, the first part on the separation of church and state, this used to be not an issue in Quebec, where I come from, because the church was in a particular privileged position and very much supported by the state. But now the state has taken over and really dictates what goes on in worship, and religion has been taken out of the public school system in Quebec. I don't know all the details for each of the other provinces of Canada, but there is a struggle there. It can't be presumed that the church and the state have a friendly relationship, and that freedom of religion is a given. It's always a struggle there, because we live in the society that we live in that doesn't necessarily respect sacred things and a sacred way of doing things. So I can't speak specifically for the rest.
All right. Now, the church in Quebec has gone through some real changes. And I'm wondering, you've been a Catholic for 20 years, was it during that 20 years, or was it already starting to make those changes before you came into the church?
Well, those changes started with Jean Lesage in the 1960s.
Okay.
And but we're seeing the effects of a lot of those changes now. We're seeing a shortage of priests. We're seeing maybe 3% of the population who go to church.
3%?
3% of the population of Quebec go to church. But about 70% still believe in God and still consider themselves Catholic. So, although a lot of churches are closing down, and we have a growth of evangelical churches in various parts of the province, there is sign of hope here too. A lot of it, I think, is due to the visit of the Holy Father last year. We have masses of young people with where they take care of all the different liturgy that they're permitted to, and they take care of the Mass a lot, have spaghetti dinners after, and we have film clubs where they meet with a priest and go and look at the spiritual dimensions of certain popular films. We have a lot going on in the evangelization of young people. So it's not the way it used to be, but there's hope for good new growth in the church.
You know, sometimes a country can be considered Catholic, as I would have thought Quebec was. And so you'll have the form of it. But again, you may not have a real deep sense of the conviction within. Now, I'm not being critical of Quebec in that sense, but it makes me wonder how it fell so fast. And we see it in America too, how things fell so fast after Vatican II and went through a difficult time. But there may be a sense in which this is the way the Lord is doing some purging and bringing new life. You know, you see when Yellowstone has this huge fire and you think it's done, and then you see the new sprouts sprouting up. And so what you're talking about are these young people that are responding to John Paul. And he's been there planting those wonderful seeds last year, and now you're seeing the good of it. And that's part of the reason for having these Catholic programs, though, is to let you see there's good things happening in Canada. And there really are. There's good life all over the place, but there needs some words of encouragement. All right. In fact, it looks like we have a caller that has some questions for you about something you mentioned earlier. Trudy from Canada, what's your question for us?
Marcos, glad to see you got a Canadian on board. I'm glad. We're regular admirers of your program. We watch you all the time.
Thank you, Trudy.
Now, my question for Julie is, what group of parents is Julie working with here in Canada, in Montreal, I think she's indicating, and could she elaborate on her apostolate?
Yes.
I work for a group called Family Development of Canada. It's been in Canada for about 20 years, and it basically trains parents to analyze and family situations in order to make better decisions, in order to build better criteria for making decisions, and to know their children better, and to build a spiral of love in their family. So that the more they know, the more they love, the more they love, the more they want to know, and it goes on and on. And this translates very well to the spiritual life. So I've been doing this with other parents for about 20 years. We have lots going on, and we always have room for more.
Now this is only based in Montreal, or is it?
It's also takes place in Quebec City and in Toronto, but it depends very much on the enthusiasm of people who are there.
All right. And then, so on the one hand, it isn't specifically Catholic, but it has a really strong Catholic element to it?
Yes,
Is
it
that the way
does.
would be? Okay.
Yeah. No, it's open to people who are non-Catholic, even non-Christian, but the ones who get more involved and go deeper into it over a longer period of time tend to be serious Catholics.
Yeah. All right. Is that because the Catholic history there in Quebec, or just because the nature of discussion about virtues?
I think it's the nature of discussion about virtues and the fact that people build friendships with each other. Families make friendships with other families. And that goes a long way in trying to do things in your family and feeling supported by others.
All right. Thank you, Julie. We have our next question. This comes from Irene in Texas. Hello, Irene. What's your question?
Hi, Marcus. I have a question for Julie. Now that she's converted, I want her to explain to your viewers as best she can the difference between the way of thinking between Anglicans and Catholics as far as artificial birth control and abortion, and how she's had to adjust her thinking because of that. And I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
All right, thank you, thank you.
Well, it was the Anglicans who first, of all the churches, first allowed artificial birth control with the Lambeth Conference in the 1930s. Right. So they were well-intended, I'm sure, in thinking that this was a responsible way of dealing with being parents. But that was followed by many other Protestant churches, and the teachings of the Catholic Church have always been that this was not really the desire of the Holy Spirit and the desire of God. There was a lot of debate about it, and there was a fair bit of bitterness and a division in conclusions, in studies of it, but the Pope went ahead with In Humane Vitae, and we've seen the fallout of birth control in many different ways. What you mentioned with abortion is following from it. When you start by treating someone as an object because you've separated the two purposes of sexual communion, it can lead to selfishness, and it can lead to people being cut off from each other and people using each other. And we had the Bishop of Denver write beautifully about that in the past few years, and also the teachings of the Christopher News people on this fallout too, with Mr. West, Christopher West. So it's to go back to Genesis and to see what the teachings of the church are in Genesis, what God really is asking of us there. And I'm sure that the Anglican Church is quite concerned about the state of the family, as is everyone. And the Catholic faith has held a very difficult position and a very unpopular one.
Difficult because it's unpopular. I mean, that's really the difficult issue, and especially when you have so many voices in our world that, points to the, quote, population explosion, or, quote, the poverty and all these issues, and really portrays the Catholic position as the uncharitable position. Well, but they're doing at the core what is best for these people, and then looking for other ways to solve their problems rather than this easy way out, which the devil will always try and find an easy way out for us, especially when it's more interested in pleasing our sensual aspect than pleasing our soul. And that's what the church has tried to protect all these years. And I'm wondering, with the change that happened in Canada, over the last 50, 60 years, with that change in the church, was there also that change in acceptance of the church's teachings on these areas?
Oh, yes, well, we now in Quebec have one of the lowest birth rate in the world.
Really?
It's very, very low. We're not even at replacement rate now. So in Quebec, people have rejected the teachings of the church in birth control. And in abortion, we have a very high abortion rate too. We also have a very high suicide rate. I don't know if that's connected to that or not. But we can see the fallout of people turning their back on the church's teachings on this. And I think maybe it's part of it is ignorance of God's loving hand in asking people to be generous, and it's also I think a misunderstanding of how wonderful family life can be. That when people live generously and love each other generously, that you can be tremendously rich and happy, maybe not materially, but in humanly, can be very rich and happy with a family. And this is something people just don't seem to learn as they could.
All right, let's take another email. This comes from JR in Ohio. I am 46 years old and looking for holiness, but pride prevents me from asking for help. I often fall back out of the faith. Does Julie have any advice for me? Thank you, JR.
I know how you feel. Have you ever thought of going to find a spiritual advisor? Because knowing myself, I don't know myself as well. I have a spiritual advisor, and I don't know my soul as well as my spiritual advisor does. Someone who can be objective with me and know where to guide me. So I think to have someone be objective with you and help you out like that is a tremendous boon. They keep, it's like a trainer. You know, you want to get really good at something, you ask a trainer to put you in shape, and you follow the advice of this trainer. So this be a trainer for your soul. It sounds to me that you have wonderful desires and intentions, just need someone to help you out, that's all.
But there's that, in his case, he mentioned that voice of pride that was always there. You know, I remember when I grew up, I remember a cartoon that, I can't even remember the main character of this cartoon that was on television, but it depicted a little angel sitting on one shoulder and a little devil sitting on the other, and he was in the midst of these voices. Well, you see, in that cartoon, when you think about it, it was belittling the idea that we were in this spiritual battle. So of course then, what it leaves our culture with is this idea that, well, the devil doesn't exist, these things are just a part of a cartoon. But the reality is that's part of our struggle with holiness.
Yes, it is.
Is we have those voices. And that's why we need a spiritual director to help us discern those voices that are always yanking us in different directions. I'm wondering, in your teaching of virtues, do you talk to people about that spiritual battle? Or is that kind of step 4, 5, and 6 after they've dealt with the more natural virtues?
No, that's sort of part and parcel of it from the very beginning. Good. Because you have a resistance to doing anything hard. And you don't want to do hard things all the time, but yeah, to try and move ahead in something and improve in something, you've got a natural resistance there. And to face up to it and deal with it, that's part of everybody's life. Mine included.
That's right, and you and me. I mean, we're all on this journey together, you know, we're all growing in holiness. That's our call, to become saints, you know. So it's interesting that you know, that priest gave you these pictures of these books of all these saints, and that's what we're to be emulate. Not so that we can have our name in one of those books someday, but because that's what we are to seek to imitate with our life, as they sought to imitate Jesus. We have an email, more information that is interesting, comes from Frank in Columbia, Missouri. He says, "Dear Marcus, for your first caller in Massachusetts, in the Boston area, there is an Anglican youth parish." And I've had that priest on the program.
Oh.
And I feel, it'll come, Father Richard, oh boy, ever since I went over 50, you know, I've been losing it. But he does have an Anglican use, which, are you familiar with the Anglican use at all?
No, I'm not.
The Anglican use are specifically for Anglican clergy who become Catholic and then ordain Catholic priests and bring with them their congregation, or at least part of their congregation. And so they have a special permission from the Vatican from the Doctrine of the Faith to use what's called an Anglican use, which is the Mass, but also taking some of the wording from the Book of Common Prayer. So you have some of that beauty that the Anglicans are accustomed to, and yet it is exactly the same Mass, just a little bit different wording. And so that's part of the reason for that, is to make the Anglicans, help the transition. And I do believe part of that reason is because what we're looking at is a potential schism, potential struggling with many Anglicans, and we want to make it easy for them to come home, to at least be open to coming all the way home and hopefully not just breaking away and forming some new group altogether. And that's what we pray doesn't happen. You know, just one last question. We're going to take a break here real quickly. For so many converts, Mary is a big problem. How was your journey with understanding Mary and your place in salvation?
Well, I learned as I mentioned to you before, I learned the Magnificat in a chant in the Anglican Church. I always wondered what I was singing about. I mean, I knew about Mary, but there wasn't much information or doctrine about Mary. And I remember before I started my interest in holiness, I mentioned to my husband that I was reading a story to my daughter and it was about Mary and Jesus and all the little brothers and sisters, and my husband said, no, 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 you can't do that. That's not right. So I thought, oh, I don't know anything about Mary, and I started to ask a little more. And then I read a wonderful book called Mary of Nazareth. And
By Kenneth Howell.
Pardon?
By Kenneth Howell, yes.
And then a friend of mine, a girlfriend of mine, gave me some things to read to consider as a woman that you can emulate, you can empathize with Mary, and that she is really our mother, and very amenable and loving and waiting for us. And it was a time for me to get to know that. I felt awkward for quite a while because it was something in which my childhood there was nothing. And all I had was the singing.
When you think about
because you think about, well, there's God the Father and there's Christ the brother, and then where does Mary fit in? You know, and she's there in the pictures, but there's no teaching about her. So she was a wonderful revelation for me as a protector and a wonderful, loving presence, and of course the mother of our Lord.
I'm anxious now to tell Ken about how Small World, because the book you mentioned, Mary of Nazareth, is written by Kenneth Howell, who not only is one of my best friends, and now I've been on the Journey Home 3 times, but was on the first time that I was on Mother Angelica to talk about. He was my guest, and he's now on the board of the Coming Home Network. And so I'll let him know that his book, Mary of Nazareth, was a help in your own journey. All right, let's take a break. We'll be back in just a moment with some final words for the Journey Home. Welcome back to our Canadian episode, our first Canadian episode of the Journey Home. Julie, how has becoming a Catholic strengthened your faith in Christ?
It's brought me the fullness of the sacraments, which I think was something missing very much so. And with those sacraments, I have become a stronger person to imitate Christ, to follow Christ, to have Christ in my daily life, and to move on towards being holy, which is the sanctification of my ordinary daily life, breathing in, breathing out all day long, and having Christ with me.
And it's exciting, your apostolate, which is this teaching of virtues, not just to Catholics or even other non-Catholic Christians, but to people in general, many which have no faith at all, but building on that ground level and then building them up into the faith. Julie, thank you for joining us in the Journey.
It's been a pleasure.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
God bless you and your continued work. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next week.